The Nexus Academy Library at midnight was David Chen's favorite place in the known galaxy, 3 stories of crystalline architecture housing the collected knowledge of 47 different civilizations, all of it accessible to anyone curious enough to seek it out. As a xenocultural studies major, David had spent countless hours in these halls, but tonight he found himself distracted by something far more fascinating than any database or historical archive. Princess Lyra Vex of the Etherian Dominion sat at a corner study table, surrounded by holographic displays showing complex xenobiological data, her translucent silver skin casting subtle reflections on the crystal walls around her. She worked with the kind of focused intensity that David had come to recognize over months of sharing the same advanced linguistics courses, her bioluminescent markings shifting through soft patterns of blue and gold as she processed information. Even among the diverse student body of Nexus Academy, she was extraordinary. The Etherians were an ancient species known for their beauty, intelligence, and almost pathological desire for cultural isolation. Princess Lyra Vex embodied all 3 traits: brilliant enough to excel in every subject, beautiful enough to stop conversations when she entered a room, and isolated enough that David had never seen her speak to another student outside of required class participation. "You're staring again," his roommate Jake had pointed out earlier that evening. "That's the 3rd time this week I've caught you watching the Ice Princess instead of studying." Ice Princess was what most of the human students called her, though never where any Etherian might overhear. It wasn't entirely unfair. Princess Lyra Vex maintained the kind of perfect composure that seemed to repel casual interaction, treating every conversation like a formal diplomatic exchange and every classmate like a potential security threat. But David had begun to suspect that the ice was more like armor than natural coldness. He'd noticed things that others missed, the way her markings flickered with what looked like loneliness when she thought no one was watching, the careful way she positioned herself at the edge of group discussions, close enough to observe but far enough to maintain distance, the slight softening of her expression when professors discussed concepts that genuinely excited her before she remembered to restore her diplomatic mask. Tonight, watching her work alone while the library emptied around them, David made a decision that would probably qualify as either very brave or very stupid. Professor Valdris had announced a major project requiring interspecies partnerships, and David had been planning to ask one of his human classmates to collaborate. Instead, he found himself walking across the library toward the table where Princess Lyra Vex sat, surrounded by the kind of invisible barrier that had kept everyone at a respectful distance for the entire semester. "Excuse me," he said quietly, not wanting to startle her from what appeared to be deep concentration. Princess Lyra Vex looked up from her displays, her violet eyes focusing on him with the kind of sharp attention that made David suddenly understand why people found her intimidating. Up close, her beauty was almost overwhelming, the silver skin that seemed to contain its own light source, the elaborate patterns of bioluminescence that traced delicate lines along her temples and throat, the perfectly proportioned features that looked like they'd been designed by an artist rather than shaped by evolution. "Yes," she said, her voice carrying the musical quality that marked all Etherian speech but none of the warmth that might make it welcoming. "I was wondering if you'd like to work together on Professor Valdris's xenocultural integration project." The bioluminescent patterns on her skin flared briefly, surprise, David thought, based on what he'd learned about Etherian emotional expression in his xenobiology courses. She studied his face with the kind of analytical intensity usually reserved for complex scientific problems. "Why?" she asked, the single word carrying layers of suspicion and genuine confusion. "Because you're the smartest person in our linguistics track, you have insights into Etherian culture that could provide unique perspectives on integration challenges, and—" David paused, trying to find the right words for something he didn't entirely understand himself. "And?" Princess Lyra Vex prompted, her tone suggesting she expected to hear about political ambition, academic opportunism, or some other calculated motivation. David looked at her sitting alone at her table, surrounded by the scattered remnants of other student study sessions, empty coffee cups, forgotten data pads, the casual debris of social learning that she never seemed to be part of. He thought about the months he'd spent watching her excel in isolation, demonstrating brilliance that no one seemed to appreciate and maintaining composure that no one seemed to question. "And because I think you're tired of working alone," he said simply. The change in her expression was subtle but unmistakable. The diplomatic mask slipped just enough to reveal something vulnerable underneath, not weakness, but the kind of carefully hidden need that came from too much solitude. "You presume to understand my preferences?" she asked, but the edge in her voice had softened slightly. "I presume to recognize someone who's been carrying the weight of expectations without anyone offering to help share the load." Princess Lyravek stared at him for several heartbeats, her bioluminescent markings cycling through colors David couldn't interpret. The library around them had grown very quiet, the last few students having departed for their dormitories, leaving them alone among the towering stacks of accumulated knowledge. "Why are you staring at me?" she asked suddenly, her voice carrying a defensive edge that suggested this was a question she'd asked before under less pleasant circumstances. David realized he had been studying her face, trying to read the emotions that flickered across her features like patterns of light on water. The honest answer rose to his lips before he could consider whether it was wise. "Because you're beautiful." The words hung in the air between them like a bridge across impossible distance. Princess Lyravex's eyes widened, her bioluminescent markings flaring brilliant silver before cycling through a rapid sequence of colors that spoke of shock, confusion, and something that might have been wonder. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her perfect composure completely shattered by three simple words that apparently no one had ever said to her before. She began, then stopped, her hand rising unconsciously to touch the patterns of light that traced along her throat. "That is, you should not." "Should not what?" David asked gently. "Notice that you're beautiful. Appreciate that you're intelligent. Wonder why someone as remarkable as you spends every evening studying alone." "You do not understand," Princess Lyravek said, but her voice had lost its defensive edge, replaced by something that sounded almost lost. "I am not, people do not." "People don't what?" She looked around the empty library as if checking for observers, then back at David with an expression that suggested she was about to reveal state secrets. "People do not speak to me as if I am simply a person. They speak to me as Princess Lyravex of the Etherian Dominion, heir to ancient wisdom, representative of superior civilization. They speak to titles and expectations and political implications." That sounds exhausting. It is the burden of royal responsibility. It's also the reason you're sitting alone in a library at midnight instead of somewhere with friends. Princess Lyravex was quiet for a long moment, her gaze dropping to the holographic displays she'd been studying. When she looked up again, her expression had changed, still guarded, but no longer actively hostile. "The Xenocultural Integration Project," she said carefully, "would require significant collaboration over several weeks." "Yes. Working partnerships between Etherians and other species are uncommon. But not unprecedented." "No," she agreed slowly. "Not unprecedented." David waited, sensing that she was working through calculations that had nothing to do with academic requirements and everything to do with personal risk. "I accept your proposal for collaboration," she said finally, her formal tone suggesting she was making an official diplomatic decision rather than agreeing to study together. "Excellent," David said, settling into the chair across from her. "Should we start by discussing research methodologies, or would you prefer to begin with defining our scope of investigation?" Princess Lyravex paused, her bioluminescent markings shifting to what David was learning to recognize as confusion. "You wish to begin immediately?" "Well, we're both here, we're both obviously night people, and the project timeline is pretty aggressive. Unless you prefer to schedule formal meetings." "No," she said quickly, then seemed to catch herself. "That is, immediate commencement would be efficient." As they began discussing the parameters of their research project, David noticed Princess Lyravex's posture gradually relaxing, her responses becoming less formal and more engaged. When she forgot to maintain her diplomatic composure, her intelligence blazed like starlight, and her insights into the challenges of interspecies cooperation revealed depths of understanding that went far beyond academic theory. "You have given this considerable thought," David observed after she'd outlined a research framework that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of both psychological and political integration barriers. It is a subject of personal interest, she admitted, then seemed to realize what she'd revealed. That is, understanding other species is important for diplomatic relations. Personal interest, David repeated. Not just diplomatic necessity. Princess Lyravex looked at him with an expression that suggested she was evaluating whether he could be trusted with something important. I have spent my entire life being told that Etherians are superior to other forms of life, she said quietly. But I have observed that superiority which requires isolation from others may not be superiority at all. The admission was clearly difficult for her, a crack in the foundation of everything she'd been taught about her people's place in the galaxy. That's a brave conclusion, David said. And it's exactly the kind of insight that could make our project groundbreaking instead of just academically competent. Princess Lyravex smiled then, a small, tentative expression that transformed her entire face from untouchable perfection to something warmly, genuinely human despite her alien heritage. David Chen, she said, using his name for the first time, I believe this collaboration may prove more illuminating than either of us anticipated. As they settled into their research planning, the Midnight Library became something neither of them had expected to find at Nexus Academy, a place where an isolated princess and a curious student could begin building a bridge across the vast distances between different worlds, different species, and different ways of understanding what it meant to be beautiful, intelligent, and worthy of connection. Outside the crystalline walls, the lights of Concordia's cosmopolitan cityscape twinkled like stars, each one representing a different species, culture, and perspective on life in the galaxy. Inside the library, two young people from different worlds began the delicate work of learning to see each other clearly, and discovering that sometimes the most important knowledge couldn't be found in any database or archive, but only in the courage to look past assumptions and see the person underneath. The transformation in Princess Lyravex over the following weeks was subtle but unmistakable to anyone who had been watching her as closely as David had. The rigid posture that had marked her early semester appearances had relaxed into something more natural, her bioluminescent patterns showed more varied colors during class discussions, and most remarkably, she had begun arriving at their evening study sessions with something that looked suspiciously like anticipation rather than dutiful compliance. The psychological barriers to integration are more complex than simple prejudice, she said during one of their library sessions, surrounded by research materials from a dozen different worlds. Fear of cultural contamination, loss of identity, and dilution of species-specific advantages all create resistance even when economic and political benefits are obvious. David looked up from his analysis of successful integration case studies, noting how her academic language had gradually become less formal over their weeks of collaboration. That matches what I'm finding in the historical data. Even species that eventually formed successful partnerships initially resisted contact because they were afraid of losing what made them unique. The irony, Princess Lyravex observed, is that isolation often leads to stagnation, while controlled integration frequently enhances rather than diminishes species-specific capabilities. Controlled integration, David repeated thoughtfully. That's an interesting phrase. How do you control something like cultural exchange? Through careful selection of interaction parameters, establishment of clear boundaries, and maintenance of core identity structures while allowing peripheral adaptation. She paused, her markings shifting to the pale blue that David had learned indicated self-reflection. Though I begin to suspect that such control may be largely illusory. What makes you say that? Princess Lyravex gestured to their research materials, then to the space between them where weeks of collaboration had created an easy working partnership that neither had expected. I came to this project believing I could maintain appropriate distance while gaining useful academic insights. Instead, I find myself, changed by the experience in ways I did not anticipate. David set down his data pad, giving her his full attention. Changed how? I question assumptions I previously accepted without examination. I find myself curious about perspectives I was taught to consider inferior. I experience. She hesitated, her markings cycling through colors that suggested internal conflict. Experience what? Enjoyment. Of collaboration. Of discussion with someone who treats my ideas as interesting rather than automatically correct because of my heritage. Her voice dropped to almost a whisper. Of being seen as Lyravex rather than Princess Lyravex. David felt something warm settle in his chest at her use of the shortened version of her name. Is that problematic? It should be. Everything I was taught suggests that such personal attachment to non-Etherian individuals compromises judgment and weakens cultural identity. And what do you think? Lyravex looked at him directly, her violet eyes holding depths that seemed to reflect starlight. I think that isolation may be the greater weakness. When you know only your own perspective, you cannot evaluate its accuracy or completeness. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of other students beginning their evening study routines. David noticed how several human classmates glanced in their direction with expressions mixing curiosity and concern, while the few Etherian students who frequented the library maintained careful distance from their princess's unprecedented collaboration. We're attracting attention, he observed quietly. Yes. I have received inquiries from Etherian embassy personnel regarding my academic partnerships. Disapproving inquiries. Concerned inquiries. There is a difference, though the practical implications may be similar. Lyravex began organizing their research materials with the efficient movements that marked all her actions. Perhaps we should relocate to a more private study environment. I know a place, David said, gathering his own materials. If you don't mind walking through the city instead of staying on campus. 20 minutes later, they sat in a small cafe in Concordia's cultural district, surrounded by the comfortable buzz of conversations in a dozen different languages. The establishment catered to the planet's diverse population, with seating designed for various anatomical configurations and menu options that could satisfy the dietary requirements of most known species. This is pleasant, Lyravex said, her markings showing the soft gold that David had learned indicated contentment. I have never visited such a place. Never. But you've been on Concordia for almost a year. Etherian diplomatic protocol discourages casual interaction with mixed populations. Too many variables, too many opportunities for misunderstanding or cultural contamination. David looked around the cafe, noting how beings from different worlds shared tables, exchanged friendly conversations, and seemed to navigate cultural differences with casual competence. It looks like people manage pretty well when they're just being themselves instead of following diplomatic protocols. Yes, Lyravex agreed, watching a table where human and Centaurian students were laughing together over shared study materials. It does appear that way. Their conversation resumed, but with a different quality than their library sessions. Away from the academic environment and formal research materials, their discussion became more personal, revealing perspectives and experiences that formal study partnerships rarely explored. What made you choose xenocultural studies? Lyravex asked, sipping a beverage that had been specifically formulated for Etherian biochemistry. Curiosity, mostly. I grew up on Earth during the early expansion period, when first contact with other species was still big news. I was fascinated by the idea that intelligence could develop in so many different forms. And now? After actually studying other species? Now I'm even more fascinated. Every culture we've researched has developed solutions to universal problems that no one else thought of. Art forms that couldn't exist without specific sensory capabilities, social structures that work perfectly for beings with different psychological needs, technologies that emerge from entirely different ways of understanding physics. Lyravex smiled, the genuine expression that David had seen more frequently as their partnership developed. That is a very optimistic perspective on diversity. You don't share it? I am beginning to. Which would surprise many who know me. Her markings shifted to deeper blue, suggesting something approaching vulnerability. I was raised to view Etherian ways as objectively superior rather than simply different. Questioning that assumption feels like questioning the foundation of everything I thought I knew about myself. Maybe it's not questioning who you are, David suggested. Maybe it's discovering who you could be. The observation struck something deep, evident in the way her bioluminescent patterns flared and settled into colors David had never seen from her before, complex combinations that seemed to reflect internal transformation in real time. "David," she said quietly, "may I ask you something personal?" "Of course." "When you first approached me about collaboration, what did you actually expect to happen?" David considered the question, remembering his motivations during that midnight library encounter. "Honestly, I expected you to say no. I thought you might be offended by the presumption, or that Etherian protocol wouldn't allow informal partnerships with humans. But you asked anyway." "But I asked anyway." "Why?" "Because you looked lonely. Because brilliance without companionship seems like a waste. Because I thought you might actually want someone to collaborate with, even if everything about your behavior suggested otherwise." Lyra Vex stared at him for several heartbeats, her markings cycling through rapid patterns that spoke of emotions too complex for easy interpretation. "No one has ever approached me based on assessment of my emotional needs," she said finally. "Political advantage, academic opportunity, social status, these are the motivations I understand and expect. But simple recognition of loneliness. Is that problematic? It is unprecedented. Which makes it either very dangerous or very valuable. Which do you think it is?" Lyra Vex looked around the cafe again, taking in the casual interactions between beings from different worlds, the easy way cultural differences were navigated through patience and good humor rather than formal protocols. "I think," she said slowly, "that I am beginning to understand why isolation may not be the same thing as superiority." As they walked back toward campus through Concordia's illuminated streets, their conversation continued to explore territory that had nothing to do with their academic project and everything to do with the gradual dissolution of barriers that had kept both of them more isolated than they'd realized. "Lyra Vex," David said as they approached the dormitory complex, "can I ask you something that might be too personal?" "You may ask. I reserve the right not to answer." "Fair enough. What would happen if you decided to pursue friendships or relationships that your people disapproved of?" She was quiet for so long that David wondered if he'd crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. When she finally answered, her voice carried notes of resignation mixed with something that might have been hope. "Theoretically. Diplomatic consequences, potential succession complications, and social isolation from Etherian society. And practically? Practically, I would discover whether personal happiness is worth the cost of disappointing everyone who has invested in my ability to represent traditional Etherian values. That's a heavy burden for anyone to carry. It is the burden of royal birth. Though I begin to wonder whether it is a burden I am required to carry, or one I have simply chosen to accept." They paused at the entrance to Lyra Vex's residential building, the moment stretched between them like a question that neither quite dared to ask directly. "David," she said finally, "our collaboration has been illuminating in ways that extend far beyond academic requirements. For me too. I want you to understand that whatever complications may arise from our continued association, I do not regret the choice to work with you. Even if it creates problems with your people. Especially if it creates problems with my people. Perhaps it is time for me to discover what I believe rather than simply accepting what I have been taught." As she disappeared into her building, David stood alone in the soft light of Concordia's twin moons, understanding that their academic partnership had evolved into something that would challenge both their assumptions about friendship, identity, and the courage required to choose connection over isolation. Tomorrow would bring new research challenges, continued scrutiny from their respective communities, and the gradual recognition that some forms of beauty, intellectual, emotional, and personal, could only be fully appreciated when experienced rather than simply observed. But tonight, David fell asleep with the memory of Lyra Vex's genuine smile and the growing certainty that sometimes the most important discoveries happen not in databases or archives, but in the simple recognition that everyone, regardless of their species or status, deserved to be seen and appreciated for who they truly were. The crisis came, as most diplomatic incidents do, at the worst possible moment. David and Lyra Vex had spent 6 weeks developing both their research project and their friendship, finding in each other the kind of intellectual and emotional connection that neither had expected to discover at Nexus Academy. Their xenocultural integration study had evolved into something groundbreaking, a comprehensive analysis of successful interspecies partnerships that challenged conventional wisdom about the necessity of cultural isolation. The data is remarkable, Professor Valdres had told them during their midterm presentation. You've identified patterns that suggest successful integration depends more on individual psychological compatibility than species-level cultural similarities. This could reshape how we approach diplomatic relations throughout the galaxy. But personal compatibility and diplomatic relations were proving to be very different things. David, Jake said as they prepared for morning classes, you need to be careful. There are rumors going around about you and the Ice Princess that could cause problems. What kind of rumors? The kind that suggest you're either trying to sleep your way into Etherian nobility or that she's using you for some kind of political intelligence gathering. Either way, people are starting to talk. David felt irritation flash through him at the casual way his roommate reduced their partnership to cynical motivations. People who obviously don't know what they're talking about. Maybe not. But perception matters, especially when one of you is literal royalty from a species that's been isolationist for centuries. The warning proved prophetic. That afternoon, as David waited in their usual cafe for Lyravex to arrive for their regular study session, he was approached by two individuals who definitely weren't students. Mr. Chen, said the woman, her bearing suggesting military or diplomatic background despite her civilian clothes. I'm Cultural Attaché Morrison from the Human Embassy. This is Security Analyst Webb. We'd like to speak with you about your academic partnerships. David's heart sank as he realized that their relationship had attracted official attention from both their governments. I'm not sure what you mean. Your collaboration with Princess Lyravex has been noted by various interested parties. We're here to discuss the implications and provide guidance about appropriate boundaries. Appropriate boundaries? Between human students and Etherian royalty, Webb explained, his tone suggesting this should be obvious. There are protocols governing contact with foreign dignitaries, even in academic settings. She's a student, not a visiting dignitary. She's the heir to one of the galaxy's most advanced civilizations and a potential key figure in future human-Etherian relations, Morrison corrected. Her personal associations have political implications that extend far beyond individual preferences. David looked around the cafe where he and Lyravex had spent hours discussing everything from xenocultural theory to personal dreams, where she had gradually relaxed her formal composure and revealed the remarkable person beneath the royal protocols. What exactly are you asking me to do? Maintain appropriate professional distance. Continue your academic collaboration if necessary, but avoid personal relationships that could be misinterpreted by either government. And if I refuse? Morrison and Webb exchanged glances that suggested they prepared for this possibility. Mr. Chen, your academic standing depends partly on maintaining good relationships with the embassy that sponsors your citizenship documentation. We're not threatening you, we're advising you that continued inappropriate association with Etherian royalty could complicate your future diplomatic career prospects. They left without waiting for a response, their message clear even if diplomatically phrased. David sat alone in the cafe, staring at his untouched drink and wondering how a simple study partnership had become a political incident. His brooding was interrupted by Lyravex's arrival, though something was clearly wrong. Her usual composed entrance had been replaced by movements that spoke of agitation, and her bioluminescent markings were cycling through colors that indicated significant stress. Lyravex? David stood as she approached their table. What's wrong? I have just concluded a very illuminating conversation with Ambassador Velthran from the Etherian Embassy, she said, settling into her chair with less than her usual grace. It seems our collaboration has attracted attention from my government as well. Let me guess, concerns about appropriate boundaries and political implications. Among other things. Ambassador Velthran was quite explicit about the potential consequences of my continued inappropriate association with inferior species. David winced at the phrasing. Inferior species. That's what they called me. That is the traditional Etherian perspective on non-Etherian life forms. Though I notice that spending time with you has made such language sound inaccurate and offensive. What did you tell the ambassador? That my academic partnerships were my own decision and that I would not accept limitations based on species prejudice rather than individual merit. Her markings flared briefly bright silver, the color David had learned indicated defiance. He was not pleased with my response. What happens now? Now I must decide whether personal conviction is worth the cost of defying cultural expectations and political pressure. They sat in uncomfortable silence, the weight of external disapproval settling over their partnership like a storm cloud. Around them, the cafe continued its normal rhythm of interspecies interaction, but David found himself newly aware of the subtle barriers that politics and prejudice created even in the most cosmopolitan environments. David, Lyravek said finally, I need you to understand something. What we have built together, this friendship, this collaboration, this recognition of each other as individuals rather than representatives, it is the most valuable thing I have experienced in my life. But it exists in opposition to everything I was raised to believe about Etherian superiority, royal responsibility, and the dangers of cultural contamination. David studied her face, noting the way her markings had settled into deep blue patterns that spoke of profound internal conflict. And that makes it wrong. It makes it complicated. My choices affect more than just my personal happiness. They impact diplomatic relations, cultural policies, and the future of Etherian interaction with other species. So what are you saying? Lyravex reached across the table, her hand stopping just short of touching his, a gesture that spoke of connection constrained by circumstances beyond their control. I am saying that I must choose between duty and personal conviction. Between representing traditional Etherian values or discovering what I actually believe those values should be. That's not fair. No one should have to choose between being themselves and fulfilling family obligations. Fairness is a luxury that royal birth does not provide, she said with bitter humor. Though I begin to think that acceptance of unfairness may be a choice rather than an obligation. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of someone David had hoped never to encounter. Ambassador Velthran himself, accompanied by two Etherian security personnel whose presence immediately drew attention from other cafe patrons. Princess Lyravex, the ambassador said in fluent but accented standard, his tone carrying the kind of authority that expected immediate compliance. Your presence is required at the embassy for urgent consultation regarding your academic activities. Lyravex stood slowly, her movements careful and deliberate. Ambassador Velthran, I was not aware that my study schedule required embassy approval. Your study partnerships require embassy oversight when they involve potential security and diplomatic complications, he replied, his gaze moving to David with obvious disapproval. Particularly when those partnerships appear to have exceeded appropriate academic boundaries. I am curious about your definition of appropriate, Lyravex said, her voice taking on the formal cadence that marked her royal training. Does it refer to academic effectiveness, cultural enrichment, or political convenience? It refers to behavior befitting Etherian royalty and the responsibilities that accompany your position. David felt the tension escalating and realized that their public confrontation was creating exactly the kind of diplomatic incident that both governments had been trying to avoid. Perhaps, he said carefully, this discussion would be better conducted in a more private setting. Ambassador Velthran's attention shifted to him with the kind of focus usually reserved for potential threats. Mr. Chen, your involvement in this situation is precisely what requires discussion. Your inappropriate pursuit of personal relationships with Etherian royalty demonstrates either dangerous naivety or calculated political ambition. My friendship with Lyravex demonstrates recognition that intelligence and worth aren't determined by species membership or political status, David replied, surprising himself with his calm tone despite the ambassador's obvious hostility. Friendship, the ambassador repeated with contempt. You claim friendship with someone whose cultural background you cannot understand, whose responsibilities you cannot appreciate, and whose future you cannot share. I claim friendship with someone whose intelligence I respect, whose company I enjoy, and whose right to make personal choices I support. Lyra Vex had been listening to their exchange with growing intensity, her bioluminescent markings cycling through colors that spoke of building resolution rather than continued conflict. Ambassador Velthran, she said, her voice carrying the kind of royal authority that reminded everyone present of her actual status, Mr. Chen raises an interesting point about personal choices and individual rights. Your Highness, individual preferences must be balanced against. Must they? She interrupted, stepping closer to David in a gesture that was both protective and defiant. Ambassador, you speak of my responsibilities and my future as if they are predetermined by others rather than chosen by me. Your future is determined by your obligations to the Etherian people and your role in representing our civilization's values. And what if I have concluded that our civilization's values require evolution rather than mere preservation? The question hit the ambassador like a physical blow. Around them, the cafe had grown quiet as other patrons sensed the political drama unfolding at their corner table. Your Highness, Velthran said carefully, such statements approach dangerous territory. Your education was designed to prepare you for leadership, not to encourage questioning of fundamental cultural principles. Perhaps that is the flaw in my education rather than in my questions. Lyra Vex moved closer to David, her action deliberate and unmistakably symbolic. Ambassador, I formally request that you arrange a meeting with the Etherian High Council. For what purpose? To present a proposal for expanded interspecies cultural exchange programs, with immediate implementation beginning at Nexus Academy. The ambassador stared at her, clearly unprepared for this development. Your Highness, such programs would require extensive review and approval processes. Which is why I am requesting formal presentation rather than unilateral implementation. I wish to demonstrate that interspecies collaboration produces better results than isolation, and I wish to use my own academic partnership as evidence for this conclusion. David felt his heart racing as he realized what she was proposing. Instead of ending their relationship to satisfy political pressure, she was choosing to make it the foundation for broader policy changes. Lyra Vex, he said quietly, are you sure about this? The personal and political risks are exactly why it needs to be done, she finished. David, our friendship has taught me that some connections transcend the artificial barriers created by fear and prejudice. If that lesson has value, it should be shared rather than hidden. Ambassador Velthran had recovered from his initial shock and was now looking distinctly alarmed. Your Highness, I must strongly advise against any formal proposals that could be interpreted as criticism of established Etherian policies. Then perhaps established policies require criticism, Lyra Vex replied with the kind of calm certainty that made her sound exactly like the future leader she was destined to become. As the ambassador and his security personnel departed with obvious reluctance and promises of further discussion, David and Lyra Vex found themselves alone again in the cafe that had become the center of their own small diplomatic revolution. So, David said, I guess we're not just study partners anymore. No, Lyra Vex agreed, her markings showing the brilliant gold that indicated determination mixed with anticipation. We are collaborators in something much larger than either of us anticipated. Are you ready for that? She smiled, the genuine expression that had become David's favorite of all her varied facial expressions. I am ready to discover whether courage is contagious and whether two people choosing to see past their differences can inspire others to do the same. As they began planning not just their academic project but their formal proposal to reshape interspecies relations, David realized that their partnership had evolved from friendship to something approaching a shared mission, proving that beauty, intelligence, and worth could be recognized and appreciated across any barrier except the artificial ones created by those who benefited from keeping different peoples apart. 3 months later, David stood in the crystalline chambers of the Etherian High Council on their homeworld of Ethros Prime, watching Lyra Vex prepare to deliver the most important presentation of her life. The journey from their cafe confrontation to this moment had been a whirlwind of research, planning, and gradually building support for what had initially seemed like an impossible proposal. Are you nervous? He asked quietly as they reviewed their presentation materials one final time. Terrified, she admitted, her bioluminescent markings cycling through rapid patterns that betrayed the anxiety she was working to control. But also excited. "We have created something remarkable, David. Whether the Council approves or not, we have proven that interspecies collaboration can produce unprecedented results." Their research had indeed been remarkable. What had begun as a simple academic project had evolved into a comprehensive framework for cultural exchange that addressed every concern about interspecies interaction while demonstrating clear benefits for all participants. More importantly, their personal partnership had become living proof that their theoretical models actually worked in practice. "Princess Lyravex," announced High Counselor Taithmiran, the ancient Etherian whose silver skin bore the elaborate markings of supreme authority, "you may present your proposal to the Council." Lyravex stood with the regal bearing that marked her royal training, but David could see the subtle differences that months of friendship had created in her demeanor. She no longer carried herself with the defensive isolation that had characterized her early academy appearances, but rather with the confident openness of someone who had learned to value connection over protection. "Honored counselors," she began, her voice carrying clearly through the vast chamber, "I come before you today to propose a fundamental evolution in Etherian cultural policy, based on research that challenges our traditional assumptions about the value of isolation." She activated holographic displays showing the data they had compiled, integration success rates, productivity improvements, technological innovations, and social stability metrics that painted a compelling picture of interspecies cooperation's benefits. "For centuries, our people have maintained cultural purity through careful isolation from other forms of life. This policy has preserved our unique capabilities and protected our social structures from external influence." "Indeed," agreed Counselor Velshar, a traditionalist whose tone suggested skepticism about where this presentation was heading. "Isolation has been the foundation of Etherian superiority." "With respect, Counselor Velshar, I propose that isolation has been the foundation of Etherian stagnation," Lyravex replied calmly. "Our research demonstrates that controlled interspecies collaboration enhances rather than diminishes species-specific capabilities while providing access to innovations that no single culture could develop independently." David watched the Council's reactions, noting the mixture of surprise, interest, and hostility that her words generated. This was the crucial moment, the point where traditional Etherian thinking would either prove flexible enough to consider new possibilities or rigid enough to reject them regardless of evidence. "You speak of research," High Counselor Taithmiran said. "Present your methodology and findings." What followed was the most comprehensive presentation David had ever witnessed. Lyravex systematically dismantled every argument for cultural isolation while demonstrating the superiority of selective integration policies. She presented case studies of successful interspecies partnerships, economic analyses showing the costs of isolation versus the benefits of cooperation, and technological assessments proving that hybrid approaches produced innovations that no single species could achieve alone. "Most significantly," she said, reaching the climax of her presentation, "we have conducted a practical experiment in interspecies collaboration that validates our theoretical models." She gestured toward David, who stepped forward with the mixture of nervousness and determination that had carried him through months of preparation for this moment. "Counselors, I present David Chen, human student of xenocultural studies and my research partner in developing these integration protocols." The reaction was immediate and electric. Several council members spoke simultaneously, their voices rising in a chorus of shock, disapproval, and fascination. "You brought a human to the High Council." Counselor Velshar's voice carried outrage that bordered on horror. "I brought evidence," Lyravex replied firmly. "For 3 months, David and I have collaborated on research that has produced insights neither of our species could have achieved independently. Our partnership demonstrates that interspecies cooperation enhances rather than diminishes individual capabilities." "A human in the sacred chambers," another counselor muttered, though David noticed that curiosity was beginning to compete with traditional shock. "Honorable counselors," David said, speaking in carefully practiced Etherian, "I stand before you not as a representative of humanity, but as evidence that intelligence, creativity, and worth transcend species boundaries." High Counselor Tathmiran raised a hand for silence, studying David with the kind of analytical attention usually reserved for complex problems requiring careful solution. Human David Chen, he said finally, you claim that collaboration with Princess Lyravex has enhanced your own capabilities. Explain this assertion. Counselor, working with Lyravex has exposed me to forms of thinking, analysis, and problem-solving that human education never provided. Her insights into psychological patterns, cultural dynamics, and social structures have expanded my understanding of how different forms of intelligence can complement each other. And Princess Lyravex? How has collaboration with this human affected your own development? Lyravex stepped forward, her markings showing the steady gold that David had learned indicated complete certainty. Counselors, my partnership with David has taught me that Etherian superiority lies not in our isolation from other species, but in our potential for leadership in interspecies cooperation. Explain. Our natural abilities. Enhanced pattern recognition, advanced analytical thinking, sophisticated emotional intelligence, make us ideally suited to facilitate collaboration between species with different strengths and perspectives. Instead of using our capabilities to maintain separation, we could use them to build connections that benefit everyone involved. The council chamber fell silent as the implications of her statement settled. Lyravex wasn't just proposing policy changes, she was advocating for a complete transformation of Etherian identity from isolated superiority to collaborative leadership. You propose that Etherians become facilitators of interspecies cooperation rather than guardians of cultural purity, High Counselor Tathmiran summarized. I propose that we become what our capabilities actually suit us to be, bridges between different forms of intelligence rather than barriers against cultural exchange. And you believe this human partnership provides evidence for such radical transformation? Lyravex smiled, the genuine expression that David had come to treasure above all others. Counselors, I believe our partnership provides proof that some connections transcend the artificial barriers created by fear and prejudice. If that lesson has value for individuals, it may have value for entire civilizations. The debate that followed was intense, passionate, and ultimately transformative. Conservative council members argued for traditional isolation, while progressive voices supported Lyravex's vision of Etherian leadership in interspecies cooperation. But the most compelling argument was David and Lyravex themselves, living proof that collaboration could enhance rather than diminish species-specific capabilities. The proposal is approved, High Counselor Tathmiran announced after hours of discussion, on an experimental basis. Princess Lyravex will oversee the establishment of interspecies cultural exchange programs, beginning with expansion of existing Nexus Academy initiatives. Furthermore, he continued, looking directly at David, Human David Chen is hereby appointed as Cultural Integration Specialist, the first non-Etherian to hold formal position within Etherian governmental structure. David felt his heart racing as he realized the magnitude of what had just happened. Their simple study partnership had become the foundation for the most significant policy change in Etherian history. Your Highness, Counselor Velshar said, his tone suggesting grudging respect despite philosophical disagreement, your proposal represents either brilliant innovation or dangerous idealism. Yes, Lyravex agreed cheerfully, it does. How do you respond to those who suggest that personal attachment to this human has compromised your judgment? Lyravex looked at David, her expression holding depths of affection and partnership that had grown from their first awkward library encounter into something that transcended simple friendship or professional collaboration. Counselor, I respond that personal attachment has enhanced my judgment by providing direct experience with the benefits of connection across difference. David didn't just help me understand interspecies cooperation, he helped me understand myself. As the council session concluded and they prepared to return to Nexus Academy to implement their approved programs, David reflected on the journey that had brought them from that midnight library encounter to this moment of institutional transformation. Lyravex, he said as they stood together in the transport facility that would carry them back to their new lives as cultural pioneers, do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had said no when I asked you to work together? I would have remained exactly what I was trained to be, a perfect representative of traditional Etherian values, isolated from genuine connection and convinced of my own superiority. She smiled, her markings showing the complex patterns that had become her signature expression of contentment mixed with anticipation. Instead, I discovered what I could become when someone saw me as beautiful rather than just powerful. And what's that? Someone worth knowing. Someone capable of growth. Someone who could choose love over fear and connection over isolation. 5 years later, the Etherian Cultural Exchange Program had become the model for interspecies cooperation throughout the galaxy, with David and Lyravec serving as co-directors of initiatives that had expanded to include dozens of species and produced remarkable advances in technology, art, science, and philosophy. Their personal relationship had evolved into a partnership that combined the best aspects of both friendship and romance, demonstrating daily that some forms of beauty, intellectual, emotional, and spiritual, could only be fully appreciated when experienced across the supposed boundaries between different forms of life. David, Lyravec said one evening as they reviewed reports from exchange programs throughout known space, "Do you remember what you said when I asked why you were staring at me? That you were beautiful. Do you still think so?" David looked at her as she sat surrounded by evidence of their shared success, her silver skin glowing with contentment, her markings showing the steady gold of someone who had found exactly where she belonged. "More beautiful every day," he said honestly. "Though now I understand that the beauty I was seeing wasn't just physical, it was the person you were waiting to become when someone finally gave you permission to be yourself." "Permission to be myself," she repeated thoughtfully. "Perhaps that is the most valuable gift anyone can offer another person. Or the most beautiful compliment anyone can receive." As they continued their work building bridges between worlds that had once seemed impossibly distant, both of them understood that their story had become proof of something larger than personal happiness, the recognition that beauty, intelligence, and worth exist in forms too numerous and valuable to be limited by the artificial boundaries of species, culture, or tradition. And sometimes, the most important transformations begin with the simple courage to tell someone they are beautiful and mean it with your whole heart.